Fantastic.
Great. Okay, so we'll start. Well, welcome to everybody who's joined us. I think we've had about 800 people say they're going to, so I don't know how many are actually on this call, but it's really exciting to be talking to so many of you. My name's Fidelity Weston. I'm chair of the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, and I'm chairing the webinar today. This is our third webinar in a series all about meadow restoration, which we've been doing in partnership with Plantlife. I just wanted to start by telling you a little bit about each of our two organisations, and just to say what a pleasure it's been to do these webinars. We've learned so much between us and made us realise how as two organisations we have so much in common. We are the PFLA is a membership organisation of mainly farmers, over 600. We promote the benefits of rearing ruminants, which are cattle, sheep and goats, from pasture only. There are broader environmental, animal welfare and human health benefits of doing this. But actually, one of the things that our farmers find is that needing to make the most of their pastures throughout the year, by definition, leads to increased diversity in their swards. And that is just really satisfying to see. And I say that as a farmer myself, and I really enjoy watching the pastures from one year to the next and how species come and go depending on the weather and everything else. So many of our members are rightly proud of their species-rich pastures, and a good number of our members are raising high-grade conservation sites. So we've got a lot in common with Plantlife. For those of you who don't know about Plantlife, that's a charity. They raise the profile, celebrate the beauty and protect the future of our wildflowers, plants and fungi. So those of you who overheard our chat earlier on will realise that they've got a big fungi deal coming up very soon. They deliver conservation through their 23 reserves in the UK and through partnership projects. They campaign, for example, on increasing diversity in roadside verges, and they carry out policy, advocacy and advisory work. Both organisations are entirely dependent on members and donations for their work. So if you feel like supporting us, please do. So moving on now to today's topic. The title is How to Restore or Create Smaller Scale Species-Rich Meadows in Any Green Space Without Livestock. To put it in the context, our first two webinars, the first one was on National Meadows Day, when we just did a straight joint celebration of meadows. Our webinar last month was showcased 3 or 4 of the Pasture for Life farmers who have used different techniques to restore meadows and to increase the diversity in their fields, using large machinery, haymaking and livestock. These sites we're covering today are sites where you haven't got access to haymaking and livestock, and so require a very different approach. We are going to, our panel is a number of people who I think you can probably all see, but we've got Phoebe Miles, who's a grassland ecologist and project manager of the magnificent project Wales project at Plantlife. Tamsin Fretwell, who's outreach officer for Magnificent Meadows Wales, based near Bangor. She works with councils, housing associations, parks and hospitals to restore areas of species-rich meadow and grassland across North Wales. We have Robbie Blackwall Miles, and we'll be seeing a video from his site, which is basically a wetland meadow site managed for the community, by the community in Llandovery, Snowdonia. And then behind the scenes, we've got Erin Schott, who's doing social media for Plantlife. Jimmy Woodrow is doing it for the PFLA. So if you're on Twitter, please use the hashtag meadow-makers or magnificent meadows to keep the conversation going. Phoebe's leading, giving the main presentation, and I should start by saying that she's had amazing technical difficulties today and giving us all heartache over whether she's going to make it or not. So congratulations, Phoebe, on getting something together for now. Basically, she's recorded some of it, and there will be videos popping in and out of her presentation, which is going to take about 50 minutes. It's going to include videos from Robbie Blackwell Miles' site in Llandovery, Derek Cobley, who manages a private meadow in Carmarthenshire, Stuart Smith from the Natural Resources Wales Office Meadow, plus others, which will include Trevor Dines, who's got a small meadow in Conwy, Chris Evans, and Tom Moses, who runs a community meadow from Priory Sortings in Haverfordwest. So I think you're in for a real treat in what you can see, I'm sure, feasting your eyes as we go through. Please do enter your questions for Phoebe or any of the rest of the panel. They'll all be there to answer at the end. if you can use the Q&A box and not the chat, that would be great. And as we go through, Tamsin, Jimmy and Phoebe will be answering questions as we go along, probably the technical ones or the referenced ones, and we'll try and keep some to the end, which I can then put out to the panelists for answering. Phoebe tells us that her presentation is probably going to last 50 minutes, leaving 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. So we aim to end at 7 o'clock. So I think without any further ado, we're going to go into your presentation, Phoebe.
Yeah, over to Jimmy first, who's going to play us a nice video from Trevor Dines' meadow in Conwy.
It may be hard to believe, but until just a few years ago, this little field on the banks of the River Conwy was thick with grasses and very few wildflowers at all. And then back in 2015, we brought in some seed from a wildflower meadow down the valley and spread it on the ground. Since then, we've followed a traditional pattern of hay meadow management, cutting the hay in late summer once all the flowers have shed their seeds, and then bringing in sheep and cattle to graze the grass until late winter. The transformation since then has been absolutely astonishing. Within the reach of my arms here, there's probably 30 different species of wildflower and grasses, and in the meadow as a whole, we've recorded nearly 100 different species. What's really exciting though is that on a single day at the height of summer, we estimate that there might be 9 million flowers blooming in this meadow. Key to the success of this meadow has been the use of natural seeding, which is where we use the seed from an ancient wildflower-rich meadow to create a new one. And there's a variety of ways in which you can do that. You can either take a cut of green hay and bring that fresh hay to the new site, which is packed full of all that wildflower seed. Or you can use a brush harvester, which goes through a little machine that goes through and flicks all the seed up into a bag for you then to use. Or indeed, there are some commercially available mixtures now that are harvested from named meadows. It doesn't really matter which of these techniques you use. The important thing is that natural seeding quickly leads to a very species-rich wildflower meadow. And most importantly of all, it helps retain that local character and identity of these meadows, which is what makes them so very, very special. Now, every wildflower meadow is unique, and over time, they kind of settle into their own rhythm with their own special wildflowers. And one of the special wildflowers in this meadow is this beautiful little rest harrow, which appeared out of nowhere a couple of years ago and has spread to form a really large patch where it's happy at the bottom of the meadow here. But perhaps most excitingly of all is Greater Butterfly Orchid, which has appeared and flowered in this new meadow. Now, it's growing at the meadow where the seed was collected. You almost think of it like a special gift from that meadow to its new daughter meadow here. I think what this shows us more than anything is just how quickly we can bring back wildflower meadows. You know, if we give these plants just a chance and provide them with the conditions that they need to thrive, they'll absolutely grab that opportunity and come back in abundance, bringing with them all the other wildlife that they support.
Thank you, Jimmy. And we're now going to start the pre-recorded bit of my presentation. You'll notice there that Trevor's meadow included some gorgeous Highland cattle, but the presentation will cover, as Fidelity said, how to restore meadows without livestock as well, in various different contexts. Jimmy.
Hi everybody, welcome to the webinar all about restoring
and creating smaller areas of native wildflower meadow in any green space, both with and without livestock. The potential across our landscape for meadow restoration is huge, whether we're talking about parks and amenity grasslands or housing estates, hospital grounds, schools, road verges, driveways and garden lawns, the in-between urban areas next to footpaths like this, for example, or the in-between rural spaces, such as this trackway, or indeed the wider rural landscape, especially on recreational areas that, for example, may have been diversified from a farming perspective to include such activities as camping. Meadows can be a big draw. Across the wider arable landscape as well, such as this arable farm in South Pembrokeshire we're working on. Across the heritage landscape too, this is Dynevor, Paxton's Tower in Dynevor, owned by the National Trust, where we're restoring the surrounding meadows, and of course churches and crematoria. Today we are talking about native wildflower meadows, which are largely comprised of perennial species of wildflower and grass. Grass is an important component part of a functioning meadow. What we're not going to focus on are annual pictorial or designer meadows, which tend to be sown each year from seed, often requiring extensive ground preparation, such as turf stripping and the application of glyphosate to prepare the ground to kill off other things, and then to sow seed from seed packets not necessarily of known provenance that may contain a high proportion of cornfield annuals, as was the case the Rotherham Town Council project, which received a lot of Twitter attention, or indeed a mixture of cornfield annuals and garden cultivars, as is the case for the Bristol project shown here on the right. And at Plantlife, we do believe there's a place for both. We do feel that on some of our less natural spaces in our towns and cities where there's little existing botanical interest, sowing annual seed packets with the application of chemicals might be an urban planner's dream, and we think it's a start in terms of providing food for our pollinators and colour for our landscapes. But what we really want to see is more species-rich grassland. We are a wild plant conservation charity, and as such, we are very much focused on the restoration of our semi-natural habitats, in this case, species-rich grassland and meadow. And you can find out more online by following that link on the Plantlife policy. So wherever possible, at Plantlife, we do advocate keeping the wild and wildflower, and we have a policy document online anyone can read. And we advocate keeping the wild and wildflower to preserve the distinctiveness and the natural genetic variation of our local flora where possible. We advocate for using natural seeding techniques, which we'll talk a bit about today, especially on larger and semi-natural areas that have already got some botanical interest to conserve. But we do recognise that perhaps smaller areas or private areas and those with less botanical interest may be approached more horticulturally. And while no two meadows are the same, semi-natural native wildflower meadows are always low nutrient habitats. They thrive on soils that are relatively low in nitrates, phosphorus and potassium. And the plants, the flowering plants that live there, have evolved in low nutrient conditions. Those nutrient conditions have been adversely affected by human activity by way of aerial nitrate deposition from traffic and modern farming systems and conurbations, So our soils are more enriched today than they once were with those nutrients, which tends to favour coarser species of plant, which can in turn smother out some of our less competitive wildflowers. Wildflower meadows are also managed habitats, either by humans or herbivores. The natural process of vegetation succession, shown here by this diagram, is essentially arrested by that management. This diagram shows the ecological succession from what would be really bare ground through to annual plants, perennials, right up to the climax vegetation type of trees. And that's what would naturally develop without the activity of either humans. Paleolithic and Neolithic man started to clear the land for agriculture, increasing the extent of grassland. Before then, it would have been the role of large grazing animals, such as the auroch, now extinct, to maintain open areas. Today, their domestic analogues, cattle, sheep, etc., do that job within the context of the farming system. So meadows very much sit at this early end of the vegetation succession timeline and are kept there by annual management. Very briefly, what does this annual management look like? In a traditional haymaking cycle, it looks something like this. It will vary from meadow to meadow, but generally speaking, over here in the spring months, you would tend to shut up the meadow from livestock to allow it to grow tall and to flower, and then to set seed later in the summer. Anytime really from mid-July through to September or even October for some meadows, you would then cut the hay, dry the hay and bale it for use later on in the winter. Around the same time, you would reintroduce the livestock back on. Freshly after the hay cut, it allows the livestock to eat off some of the thatch, which is really helpful, and to tread in some of the seed as well that would have been threshed out with the cutting process. And then right through the winter months, some livestock grazing to keep the sward low, to keep the nutrients from rotting into the soil, which is what you want to avoid with a meadow in the winter, would be good, although weather dependent and livestock dependent, all depends on the site and the situation, but keeping the sward. Another type of annual management might be the pasture management cycle, which is really very similar in terms of shutting up the meadow in the summer months to allow the plants to grow, to allow the plants to set seed, and then reintroducing livestock grazing in the later summer months or the early autumn to reduce the vegetation height. Pasture management tends to create a more tussocky mosaic with different patches preferentially grazed by animals rather than having a homogeneous cut. Really good for invertebrates. Similarly, livestock would be allowed on to some extent throughout the winter months, depending on the site and the situation, the landowner and the livestock owner. And the third, more modern type of management might be a no livestock meadow, a mowing meadow, if you will. And all we're doing here is replicating the role of grazing with cutting or mowing or scything. So allowing the meadow to grow again in the summer and then cutting it late summer, early autumn. And as we'll see later on, doing various things with the clippings, but making sure that they are essentially removed from the majority of the site. And then keeping it low over winter. And depending on the weather, that might mean more or less cutting. So to summarise, most, although not all meadows, will be managed through a mixture of either grazing or cutting, with the summer months shutting up the meadow to allow it to grow, flower and set seed. We say keep it low in the winter and let it grow in the summer months.
I'm here at the Natural Resources Wales offices in Bangor in Penrosgwynedd, and I'm here looking at their amazing meadow. I've never seen so many orchids, just so beautiful. Okay, so I'm here with Stuart Smith, who's the grassland ecologist for Natural Resources Wales, and Stuart's sat amongst these beautiful orchids. Stuart, when you have a look around at this area outside the offices, what do you think about it?
Well, it's just a fabulous thing to have, really. You know, the office I work in, so you know, you come in every day and park your car, and first thing you see as you get out of your car is a lovely scene like this if you're in the summer. So it's just beautiful to see, really.
How did the meadow get to look so beautiful? What was the management process? I mean, I've heard about people stripping turf and getting seed. How did you do all of that here?
Well, we were pretty lucky actually, because we've not done anything like that. We basically, the building here was built in about 1980, and there must have been some areas of some wildflower meadow left behind from the old fields. It used to be some old pasture land, and so nobody realised it was here for years. And then when NRW moved into the building, or CCW as it was then, people started looking around saying, well, actually, there's quite a few flowers here. And so we then changed the management. We basically don't cut the meadows for about 6 months of the year, from March until October. And we just let everything grow up in that time. And this is what you get, basically. So then when October comes, we start cutting. And then we keep it pretty short over the winter time. And then, as I say, sort of once April comes along again, we just let it grow up like this. So we've not done anything else.
So you never brought in any seeds from anywhere else?
No seeds been brought in. I mean, some things probably came here on their own accord. Some of the orchids, for example, because orchids have very small seeds, tiny seeds that you blow around in the wind. So we assume that some of those have come in on the wind, but most species would have probably been here anyway at very small amounts and have gradually expanded.
So, Stuart, do they take the cuttings off after they've mowed?
Yeah, so it's cut in October, early October, I think it is, and then the cuttings are left for about a week. So then any seeds in the cuttings can then sort of drop down into the sward, and then the cuttings taken off and they're basically dumped in a sort of shady corner somewhere. And then from then on, every time the sward is cut over the winter, they will remove the cuttings, because what you don't want is cuttings left here that would kind of smother the grasses and herbs.
And did it take many years? I mean, did it look horrible for a few years?
It never looked horrible. It was always, there was always a few flowers here, and even a bit of long grass can look quite nice. And, but it's definitely a lot more species rich now than it was. But yeah, straight away that when we started stopping the cuts through the summer, it looked nice straight away, really.
Wow, that's brilliant. And out of all these beautiful flowers that we've got growing here, are there some species that are more exciting than others?
Yeah, well, we have 4 species of orchid here for a start, so they're always quite interesting. And the one I've got in front of me here is the common spotted orchid, which is relatively common. It's probably one of the commonest orchids in Britain. It's still nice to have it, but we've got 3 other species that are less common. We've got bee orchids, northern marsh orchid, and also the greater butterfly orchid, which we're particularly proud of. We've so far only had 2 greater butterfly orchids, but one over there, though, it's just, unfortunately, it's just sort of going over now. It's getting a bit late for it. And it's really nice to have them. We don't know how they got here. Again, as I was saying, with orchids, the seeds are very small, so they may have blown in. But certainly with the common spotted orchids, they get more and more each year, so it's just beautiful to see them really.
Huge thanks to Stuart Smith at Natural Resources Wales for filming that with Tamsin. Jimmy, have we got a glitch?
We have a look.
Just forward the slide. Just need to get onto the next one, which isn't a video.
Hang on.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you could play it. In terms of restoration steps then, we would say that observation is always the first on the list. See what is on your site, existing vegetation, see what soils and slopes and hydrology you have, and look around you as well. What's adjacent to your meadow? What might come in on the wind? Reinstating annual management would be the next obvious step to see what happens, just like Stuart did at NRW. And then, if not much happens, we would look at enhancement options by way of ground preparation and natural seeding techniques. So a bit more on observation then. There's lots and lots of guidance online about this, but the soil type, the texture, the pH, the nutrient status, the slope and aspect, and also the wetness of the site will all influence what sorts of vegetation can grow there. The past land use is really important to understand. Has it been previously grazed? Has it been used to plant crops? Has it, as much of our pasture land has in the UK, been reseeded with usually a white clover ryegrass mix after a ploughing for intensive, usually cattle dairy management? And like I said, what's nearby? What's in the locale? What do you have in your adjacent field or patch? And I think one of the most fun bits of any meadow restoration is really having a look to see, well, what already lives there? Because what's there can tell you a huge amount about all of those things that I've just said. So here we have three very common examples of what we would call positive indicator species. These species indicate a lot of potential for a meadow site. We've got bird's-foot trefoil, oxeye daisy, common knapweed, and there's lots of advice on our Magnificent Meadows website online about additional positive indicator species. If these guys show up, we would suggest that the first step following that is to simply reinstate annual management and to allow nature to do the rest. Yes, some patience is needed, but if you allow nature to do its own work, you will allow natural seeding to take place, and you will preserve that local distinctiveness that we talked about earlier.
My name's Derek Cobley, and together with my wife Felicity, we manage this meadow at Blaentir, which is about 3.5 miles outside Llandovery at about 600 feet. But the field is surrounded by oak trees. It has been suggested that the oaks provide a microclimate which allows for the diverse nature of the flora that we get on this field. The field, which we've had for about 26 years now, is of unimproved grassland. As far as we know, there's been no fertiliser put on this ground for the last around 40 years. I'm afraid the field isn't looking its best at the moment. It was cut at the beginning of September, about 2 weeks ago. It was cut by the local farmer who takes off the grass. He only does the one cut, always after the middle of August. And he's done that every year for him.
When we bought the cottage, as I say, about 26 years ago, it came with a field, but we didn't really think about the field until we moved in. and looked at this field, and then several farmers came and said, oh, could they have it for sheep, or could they put horses on it? And we had the idea to make it a wildflower meadow. Felicity had always loved wildflowers, and she'd learnt their names from her father. So we looked over, we asked people, we read a few books, and assumed that we'd have to do quite a lot of work, until someone suggested that before we did anything, we talked to the recorder for Carmarthenshire for flowers, Richard Price, who, a lovely man, appeared one afternoon, did a survey of the field, and he told us basically do nothing with it. Just leave it and look at it and see what happens. And since then, that's really what we've done. But we talked to the farmer, as I said, and we arranged that once a year he would cut it. Quite late, but he agreed, although I'm pretty sure he thought we were mad. And we then just left the field to see what would happen. So we feel a bit like frauds talking about our field, because it hasn't been a huge effort. All we've had to do is not interfere. So for a few years, we followed Richard's advice. Richard had been more interested and excited by some sedges he'd found, but we certainly were most excited when the orchids started to appear all over the bottom half of the field until they formed a pink carpet in the end of May, beginning of June. There must have been well over 2,000 of them by the end. And then gradually more and more flowers came, more and more varieties, until in 2002, we found the first greater butterfly orchids. It was just 3 spikes the first year. The next year there were 7. It went to 14, then 24, then 60, 170. And by the year 2012, there were over 300 and we'd given up counting. We wrote to Richard to tell him. And as a result of his visit to see the orchids, he brought a group of members from the British Botanical Society. They found over their day exploring our field and the surroundings, well over 130 different species of plant. The other plant that had appeared around that time was Dyer's greenweed, which is another plant that is becoming rarer. You asked me to talk about any difficulties we've found over the years. Well, for the first 10 years, the field just blossomed and we just enjoyed it. But then gradually we did notice some jobs that needed to be done. We began to notice that there was about a 10-metre strip running right round the edges of the field where it was very few flowers and a lot of very tall grass. This was because the low branches on the oak trees meant that the tractor never cut it each year. Also, this was the area where all the leaves from the oak dropped in the autumn. Rich leaf mould, uncut grass, meant fewer flowers and tall rank grass, shading out the few flowers that did try and grow there. So we got Ivy Dunham from Conservation and Trees to come and take a look. And she came, they cut the lower branches of the trees so that the tractor could get underneath. It has made a huge difference. The farmer gained a few extra bales of hay, and we can get to clear the brambles, bracken that were beginning to develop in those areas around the edges. A few years back, 2017, I think, the late summer, early autumn was incredibly wet in Wales. The farmer couldn't cut his own fields, let alone ours, and so our field was left uncut. The next summer, the difference was amazing. The flowers just weren't there, and the effect, if I'm honest, of that 1 year missed is still visible even today. Of course, this might be because of all the strange weather we've been having ever since. Heat waves, storms, torrential rain. Other meadow growers have had the same problems. And I know that because I'm a member of the Carmarthenshire Meadows group. It didn't even exist when we started our meadow. But it's been great because you can compare notes with others, find out their solutions. And generally, it would have made our lives so much easier when we had that mad idea 26 years ago. So there we are, 26 years, and the meadow is still flowering and still there to be enjoyed.
And huge thanks to Derek Cobley for recording that lovely video for us.
My name's Derek Cobley.
As is often the case, though, you might observe your site and find that you haven't got lots of lovely positive indicators, such as bird's foot trefoil and oxeye daisy, but instead you have a dominance of creeping thistle or dock or nettle. And these are what we would call negative indicators. And whilst they are a valid part of our native flora, the presence of these species indicates that the site is in less good condition for species-rich meadows. It tends to indicate that the soils are probably quite high in nutrients, favouring the nitrophilous, nitrogen-loving species such as this at the expense of the less competitive wildflowers. It might also, especially in the case of docks, suggest some compaction, possibly by previous grazing. And we often find in our sort of urban landscape, when people contact us about creating mini meadows, say on housing estates or road verges, that the site's been mown for many years, but the clippings have been left in situ, or leaflet has been allowed to build up, and therefore just grass, very coarse grasses with nettles and docks are present, and that's really because of the build-up in nutrients. So in this case, we would say that enhancement options are being required rather than just reinstating annual management. You might want to help it along a little bit more. Just a quick note that agriculturally improved, so artificially improved pasture by way of ploughing and reseeding, because it's been ploughed and resown with seed mix, usually ryegrass and clover, its fungal networks have been disrupted. Its soil biota is probably less as a result of chemical and fertiliser inputs. And therefore, in terms of restoring improved pasture to species-rich grassland, it's a challenge, it's a long-term effort. We would actually question whether or not another habitat type by way of tree planting or woodland creation might be more suitable for such sites. So what do we mean by enhancement? Well, really we mean two things. We mean removing biomass and opening up the turf. So we mean cutting and grazing to remove the sward, making sure the clippings are taken off and either put in one area or baled or removed altogether, and then keeping that sward short until March, either by mowing or scything or grazing. And then in terms of opening up the turf, we would talk about ground preparation techniques such as scarifying or harrowing to open up the turf and create areas of bare ground which act as germination gaps for your flowering plants. Yellow rattle is a really helpful plant as well because it's semi-parasitic on grass, which means that it can actually help to knock back some of the grass, creating more space for flowering plants, herbs. So the order of events would be very simply to cut the meadow late summer or in the autumn, to rake off or remove the clippings, to scarify, harrow, and then sow and tread in yellow rattle seed. Okay, so Trevor purchased a small herd of Highland cattle there you saw for his meadow, but what happens if you haven't got your own livestock and you have the ability to host some, but you don't have your own? Well, we would always encourage you to think firstly about whether you've got fencing and water infrastructure in place. Is the site secure? And we would always encourage you to ask around, really. Ask your local farmer, grazier, smallholder or equine owner. It might be surprisingly easy to source a couple of sheep. It might be surprisingly difficult too, it does depend on where you are. But we hear a lot of the time from inquirers about their successes having asked or written to their local farmers. You can also ask local meadows groups where they exist. And where they don't exist, we would always support the setup of a new one. If grazing isn't an option for you, but it's a rather large area where you would require a mechanical mower or a sit-on mower, again, ask your neighbours. We tend to find that mowers love mowing and they will oblige if asked to come along and cut your site. The laborious bit is often then raking it off afterwards if you don't have an automatic collect machine like a Rytec. So raking off, it's a family or a volunteer fun day. It's quite hard work on your own. Get people involved. If you're in Wales and your site is publicly accessible, we might have some funds and staff time available to help you with these enhancement steps on your meadow. So do get in touch with Plantlife if so. Sourcing green hay and local seed is the same sort of story in terms of where you are will influence how easy or difficult that might be. Initial steps would be to ask your local Coronation Meadow, you can find those online. Have a look to see if you have a local meadows group. The wildlife trusts can often donate green hay from their own sites, and also your local churchyard might already be managing an area for wildlife and might be able to give you some of the cuttings from their summer cut. God's Acre is a lovely organisation that do just that. They're on Twitter. Also consider hand collection of seed. I've actually restored small community meadows from collecting road verge seed from publicly accessible road verges. I've also collected seed by hand from private sites after getting landowner permission. It's slow work, but it's very enjoyable and it makes for a good day out with friends or family. There are commercial providers, as Trevor mentioned in his video. We would always ask that you check the seed provenance, that it is native, and also that it's the right type for your particular site. If you know that you've got a very acidic site or a very wet site, do choose a seed packet that suits. Now, given the paucity of species-rich grassland in England and Wales and Scotland, we also have a paucity of seed. Seed shortages are common, and we would encourage you to think a year in advance wherever possible. Meadows groups. In terms of accessing these, a quick Google will determine whether you have one in your region. These are the ones, these are the established groups we know of, but there are also new groups. For example, in Wales, a new group is being set up on the Gower Peninsula, in the Llandovery as well, in the northwest and elsewhere. So do check online and also check Facebook. Okay, now we're going to change theme a little and go to a community meadow in Llandovery, northwest Wales.
I'm here at Caerdydd Community Meadow by Llandovery in Gwynedd in northwest Wales. And I'm here to meet Robbie Blackwall-Miles, who started the community group. Hiya, Robbie.
Hi.
So, how long has the group Ffrindiau Caerdydd been managing this site?
So we've been managing it for between 7 and 8 years. It must be nearer to 8 years. We manage it in conjunction with Gwynedd County Council and Padon Country Park, although we do most of the management on the site. And that is not a huge amount of work. So we cut it once a year, sometimes very late in the year or very early in the year. And we do some stuff like pulling dock and making sure that the marsh ragwort doesn't take over in here.
Why did the group take on management of the site?
So the meadows here on the edge of Llyn Padon used to be really heavily grazed by both sheep and horses. The horses became
quite aggressive towards members of the public. This has got a public right-of-way going right across the middle of it, and that public right-of-way takes all of the tourists in Llandovery across to the National Slate Museum. So it can be quite busy here at times, so to have aggressive horses on the site was no good. When the grazing came off, we noticed that there was a few really interesting wildflowers appearing. Things like sneezewort and devil's bit scabious, which, given how heavily grazed it was really surprising. And that's when I started chatting to a few members of the community about how we could best move forward, making sure that this area of life was looked after.
And have you noticed through the management that you've been doing an improvement in the site, in the species richness?
Absolutely. When we very first took on the site, we did a species survey, and we found that there was on average about 8 vascular plant species per square metre. A couple of years ago, we did a similar survey, and we found in some areas of the site over 30 vascular plant species per square metre. So we've had a huge impact from some very simple management techniques.
Well, that's really impressive. So what have you done that's made such a difference?
The first thing that we did was we brought in a cutting regime. We don't have any grazing on the site, although there is some incidental grazing from sheep that manage to get in here in the winter and spring, which is okay by us because actually it could do with a bit of grazing. But we can't have permanent grazing on here, and certainly not cattle, which would be my preferred method of grazing.
Is that because of public?
Because of public access issues. There's no gates on the site anymore. If I wanted to put cattle on here, I'd probably have to put up a system of electric fences in place, and we would need things like a corral so that we can move the cattle about, which starts to put some infrastructure on the site, which is quite difficult. So cutting it is. That happens, as I say, once a year. We would like it to be a little bit more than that some years. It would really help with reducing the number of grass species on the site. But also we do some stuff like dog pulling. So initially, because of the fertility of the site, there was a lot of dog nettle on the site. We have people like Kath Wills, who's one of our volunteers, that comes down here and diligently pulls all of the dock flower heads each year. The amount of dock that we get has vastly reduced because of it.
Wow, so you're not digging them up,
No,
just taking the heads off?
We also have some problems with marsh ragwort, which, although it is a native species, has the ability to be a bit of a thug on a wet meadow like this. So we do keep an eye on that. We've not had to pull it yet, but every year we have a little look at the amount of marsh ragwort plants there are and whether they're going to cause any problems with pushing out any of the other species on the site, and review it. We do have some Himalayan balsam here because we're right next to water. We get rid of that pretty quickly, and there's a whole team of villagers that as soon as they see a Himalayan balsam plant in flower, that's it, it's gone. Going back to the grazing, we cut the meadow on a patchwork method. So we don't cut every single bit of the meadow every single year. It does leave some challenges in so much as we get regenerating willow and regenerating scrub on the site. But what it also does is it creates a safe haven in the site for wildlife here, and it reduces the costs. So we're not cutting all of our 2.01 hectares every single year, and as such, the cost of getting to the site to cut it is much lower.
So who pays for the cutting?
We raise money each year to do it. We don't have to raise very much. It costs about £600 each year to have the whole thing cut. We don't bale. We dump our risings into our scrub line, which is a really important habitat in its own right. And those risings also become an important habitat in their own right too. In fact, every winter when it's pretty bleak here, the warmth coming off the piles of risings is really, really nice. And we see loads of activity, animal scats, so otter, we've seen otter scat, we've seen polecat scat, we've seen lots of burrows and things like voles. grass. So, actually, to be able to do that and to know that we've got a place in the form of a scrub line to dump all that stuff is really good.
That's brilliant.
Huge thanks to Robbie for that video.
I'm here at
And just to pick up on what Robbie was saying there about a patchwork mosaic, if we remember that biodiversity requires a diversity of habitats, then we can challenge some assumptions about what a good meadow looks like accordingly. Does it have to be a big area, completely open, with no scrub, with no hedgerows, with no scattered trees? We suggest that actually, in keeping with pragmatic meadow management, where resources might be limited, where cutting the whole site, for example, might not be an option, where areas of scrub may be left, albeit limited to an area, you're actually doing wildlife a great favour, because different species need different things. And even the same species across its life cycle, taking the butterfly as an example, needs different things at different times, different heights of vegetation, different types of vegetation, patches of bare ground for thermoregulation, and so on. So we are very much pro-mosaic management of meadows, which often fits well with resource limitations, as Robbie described anyway. Let's hear from one more meadow mosaic.
We're here today at Priory Saltings Nature Reserve.
So this is a wonderful spot right on the edge of Haverford West, literally walking distance, and many people just don't know it's here. It's got a rich history.
So here at the southern end of the site, we can see, looking down over the river estuary, that this is actually an artificially elevated place. It's a former rubbish tip, a rubbish dump, and it was capped in the 1960s, early 70s. So as a result of this history, there are a number of features. There's a mosaic of habitats. Some of these are wetlands, dry. There's nutrient-rich areas and other areas where the soil is poor. And it's next to the river. And all of these combined make it such a fantastic place for local biodiversity.
People have been pretty involved already in creating this site. There's been different groups and individuals coming in, doing tasks, creating access to the site. So there's been a boardwalk that's been built by college students. And other groups have come in and done habitat work. There's tree planting and some of the initial jobs in getting this meadow creation project underway.
We're working with Claire Flynn, Outreach Officer for Plantlife. We heard about their Magnificent Meadows Cymru project, and we decided that that's something that Haverford West Town Council would like to be involved with. The project is to create species-rich, natural meadows, to reintroduce them, recreate them in Wales. The aim now is to manage it. This is the area in the centre that we're looking at to create new species-rich meadows. Indigenous wildflower plants. Shortly the contractor will be coming to cut the site with a big hay cut, clear this central area and bring back the ground. So this is one of the heaps that's scattered around the site, or the remains of the heap of grass that we've raked off on the cut that happened last month to clear the grass, take it away and stack it so that we don't enrich the soils. We're looking to create nutrient poor soils that wildflowers can enjoy and colonise the site.
So recently, volunteers have gone and collected seed from a lovely plant called yellow rattle, and that's going to be spread back onto the site once the ground's been prepared. And yellow rattle actually works with other plants to improve the quality of the meadow. So what do you hope to see at the end of the project, Chris?
Ideally, we're looking to see increased biodiversity, a place that's rich in plant life for pollinators, and at the same time, alongside that, increased community engagement. It's so near the town. It's increased people's understanding of the sites by providing events and interpretation, and generally encouraging the people to come and visit. Locally, this is really a key strategic site location because it's part of a larger project called the Cleddau Reaches, which is looking at green space and natural habitat along the river corridor, both north and south, and through the centre of Haverfordwest. And all of that is hopefully going to be connected up in the future, giving people easier and better access to nature.
This final short section of the webinar is going to look at lawns and smaller private spaces, such as this fabulous garden meadow sent to us by Dominic Murphy, full of pyramidal orchids and lots of other lovely things. Hoary plantain, I think that is. Lawns are often very good examples of remnant old grassland. They haven't necessarily been used for food production, for example. So they might have been undisturbed with their soils and soil biota left intact for a very long time. Might have a really exciting seed bank if mowing pressure in the summer months was reduced. Often you can see some quite incredible things pop up. This is a photo shared with us by Ben Porter in the Llŷn Peninsula in northwest Wales, of a lockdown lawn. This is what happens when second homeowners couldn't get to the property to manage the lawn as they normally might over the summer. They gained some fantastic orchid species in there. Alas, lawns aren't always spectacular. These images show my lawn at the previous house I lived up for many years. In the first year I was there, I instituted bit of meadow management on my lawn, keeping it short over the winter months, letting it grow from spring to early autumn. And I had a paucity of wildflowers. It was mainly some nice fine grasses, a bit of cat's ear and dandelion. But I continued to observe the little patch that I had and manage it as a little mini meadow. And in year 2, very notably, I've managed to increase the abundance of wildflower species. Which was marvellous. We had a lot less grass and a lot more cat's ear, red clover and white clover. We will show a video shortly of how you can enhance a lawn meadow through some simple steps to open up the turf and sow some seed. Before we do that, just for technology reasons, I'm just going to share a few solutions to some common problems with urban spaces managed as meadows, one of which is the charge of untidiness. People who are used to short-cut grass often feel that if left to grow long, it's essentially been abandoned or unmanaged. And a very simple solution to overcome this perception is to do what we call framing mowing or lip mowing, which is mowing around the edges of a meadow to make it look intentional, managed and kept. And managing mowing paths through it as well is a wonderful way of drawing people through the meadow, inviting them to actually observe what is a managed space. And there are 2 more examples shared with us by Pauline Higgins and the Mannerings. And another thing you can do in public spaces or publicly visible spaces is put up a bit of interpretation signage. These are 3 of our favourites. As is the case at one of the sites we're working at, Withybush Hospital in Pembrokeshire, though, signs are all well and good, and they're a very important part of the process. Publicity also plays a part, and they did a very good job of communicating on Twitter and social media what they were up to as they instituted a new management regime at the hospital grounds. But alas, it doesn't always work, at least not initially. And what's key to this is ongoing publicity, ongoing communications and liaisons with everybody involved, and a little bit of patience as well. Quick word on road verges, which we see as no livestock meadows. There's some before and afters there. And a famous example of a Dorset road verge. Do head to our road verge campaign page online for full booklet on how to manage verges. And we finish on an image of a lovely Bedfordshire Roadside Nature Reserve. Thank you.
Phoebe, thank you very much indeed for that presentation. Can
Thank
you all hear
you.
me?
Yes, I'm just
good. Wonderful presentation, and thank you to all the many individuals who presented videos and things on it. It was a really fascinating collection. I loved the variety of sites, from wetland to scrubby areas to pristine meadows. Just wonderful selection, so thank you very much. There have been lots of questions coming in as we've been coming along, and the team behind the scenes have done a brilliant job of keeping those questions answered. I'm going to just pick up on a few questions that came in before the presentation, which I think still possibly haven't been answered by you all. So I'm just going to run through some of these, and please, everyone who's listening in, do feel free to add in more questions on the Q&A, and we'll try and pick them up too. So we probably had a dozen or so questions sent in, and they fell into a few categories. I think one of the questions, which Matt maybe should answer, but that quite a few people were mentioning how they tend to lose flowers some years, and other years get too many flowers. Yellow rattle was something that's been picked out, particularly as having been very abundant in a field one year and then very sparse a following year. This year it appears that lots of fields have had an abundance of ladies' bedstraw, which maybe they feel they don't want. So what's your view about this change in species? Should anything be done about it? And have you any idea what the reasons are for it? Matt, are you able to answer that for us? Or anybody else? If anyone else wants to, maybe just need to put your hands up.
I mean, I'll give you my personal view on this, to be honest. You know, I would say that meadow is a natural system that we're kind of manipulating through management. Plants are quite variable from year to year. They're affected by weather. They're affected by the management that happens. They're also affected by the soil as well. So all of these kind of things will have a bearing on what potentially will grow in a meadow. And some years, some plants do better than others. So personally, I wouldn't be too worried about the fact that one year, one plant may be dominating or more obviously visible in a meadow than another year. And those other plants are most likely probably still there. They just may be doing a slightly better for whatever reason. You know, we tend to get fixated on the fact that, okay, we've got slightly less orchids one year than another year. And actually, if you look at it over, I mean, ultimately, I suppose you need to look at these things over a much longer period of time to get an understanding as to what's going on in the meadow. And there are so many external factors. You know, our management is just one of those factors that, you know, that will have a bearing on those species. So I am generally fairly relaxed about the fact that, okay, one year, one plant is dominant. And, you know, also when meadows are going through a creation and a restoration, you tend to find that certain species will dominate one year, and then the next year they may be less dominant, and then another species will take over, and this kind of pattern goes on for maybe 5 to 10 years until the meadow then starts to settle down. So that's quite common when people are first restoring meadows. So I'll stop now.
So yes, so related to that actually, and anyone else might like to answer this, is how you actually get species going. So I mean, yellow rattle is something which is often talked about, and it seems that some people have great difficulty in getting it started and others don't. So one of the questions that we've been asked is it better to use seed or plugs, or should we just sit back and wait for the natural seed bank to do the work? I think Phoebe sort of answered the question about the natural seed bank, which is that you should sit back, but sometimes it may just not be there. So I think the answer really is using seed or plugs. Does anyone have a particular view about that in order to get them going?
I'm happy to speak about this.
Thank you, Robbie.
So in the meadow that I manage, we've gone down the very natural route, and it has been a really slow process. So we've not actually introduced anything, and yet in that time, just a couple of years ago, yellow rattle turned up of its own accord. So it got there somehow, I don't know how, and has very slowly progressed across the meadow. So that's been really nice to watch, because it's been a very natural process of the yellow rattle's establishment. That's not to say that we haven't thought about introducing things to the meadow. And certainly other meadows that I've been involved in, I've used both plugs and seed techniques, and in one meadow I used both. And it really does depend on the meadow, I think, more than anything. Certainly with yellow rattle, it's not something that you can then, it's not as easy to buy it as plug plants, and although you can buy it as plug plants. So if you can get really good fresh yellow rattle seed, I would suggest using seed for yellow rattle. But actually sometimes you might sow a complete host of different species as seed, and that particular year isn't really great for the establishment of some of those species. So you might just get one thing dominating. Very often it's oxeye daisies. And so you might want to introduce things with plugs. So there is no right or wrong answer, is I think what I'm saying. Go with the flow of your meadow. It's a very kind of, it's something that you kind of feel, and the meadow will help give you a lead on as well. And that's one of the reasons why in Caerddol we actually decided not to do anything, because the meadow told us that we didn't need to do anything.
Can I just come in there as well? I mean, if you are thinking about using yellow rattle, and it's something that lots of people have picked up, and you know, there's lots of information about using yellow rattle to try and kickstart a restoration and try and suppress the grass. Probably the most important thing is that you get seed that you know is fresh, because the viability of yellow rattle seed is not, it has quite a short life, so it won't last very long. So if you've got a packet that you stuffed in a drawer and then you get it out a year later, that seed will not be as fresh, and therefore not as much of it will germinate, and that deteriorates over time. So try and use it the same year that it's been harvested, or try and find out if you buy it when it was harvested, and try and use it as quickly as possible. The other thing about rattle is that it needs to be sown in the autumn, because it needs cold weather to stimulate the germination. And many people try sowing it in the spring, and then they don't have very much success. Well, they don't have success because there's not enough cold weather to stimulate the germination. Although it germinates in the spring, it needs a period of cold weather over the winter to help stimulate that germination.
I have heard of people, Matt, who put the yellow rattle seed in their fridge before sowing it.
Yes, that's a very hit and miss approach. And unless you're the Millennium Seed Bank with very, very technical equipment, and you know exactly what temperature and how long it's been in there, and you can control it. I mean, some people seem to have success doing that, but I think it is very hit and miss. So we would just basically always say, just try and sow it in the autumn.
Yes.
Or, or late summer, really.
So I think relating to this is another question, which actually Phoebe covered the issue of weeds that indicate a nutrient-rich soil, and nettles are one of them. And a question that's just popped in at the moment on the Q&A and sort of leads on for this is that if, say, you do have a patch of nettles and you want to increase the wildflower diversity in it, so it's by definition enriched, would you recommend scraping off a layer of soil and the rhizome layer as well? Do you have a view about preparation?
Phoebe, I think you should answer that one.
Okay, well, yeah, there are some sites, there are some sites that I look at and I have to be a little bit blunt with people about the potential. So, for example, we get called out to some road verge sites that are just wall-to-wall nettle. And without serious staged intervention, that site probably won't, through management, ever get to species-rich meadow within living lifetime. Within living
100 years, maybe.
Yes, with, graft year in, year out. So I think it's best to say to people, look, some areas aren't the areas for meadow. And nettles are one of my favourite plants because they're so important for quite a lot of our moths, butterflies and other invertebrates, and they are part of the mix. So patches of nettles, even though we don't necessarily value them as an ornamental or as wildflower, are important, and they are so difficult to get rid of. Personally, I would say let nettles be nettles. That would be my view.
Okay, thank you. And so actually, what's your view? I may as well fire this back at you, Phoebe, which is that a question came in earlier today from a woman who lives in the suburbs of Newcastle, and she's got a tall may tree at the back of her garden. And so she's got a wild area. She's tried several times to scatter wildflower seed, bought at the supermarket in this very shady area. What's your advice on that? She hasn't had any luck with her supermarket seed in this particular area.
Yeah, so it sounds like a shaded area. It sounds like, you know, therefore a woodland seed only would work there. You're talking, you know, things like honesty and foxglove might work there, or some spring bulbs. Personally, I would go for spring bulbs. I wouldn't probably focus on the perennial native meadow species. I'd probably focus on garden bulbs. It depends on the soils, and you might have to dig out. Often around those sorts of trees, you get quite a lot of compaction of the soil around the root systems. So you might need to prepare the ground. I personally probably, again, not choose that for open habitat meadow flowers, but instead go for some winter bulbs, spring bulbs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What about, again, quite a few people have written in talking about, the question really is there a place for docks, thistles, encroaching bracken and mare's tail?
This is my...
Yeah, go on, Robbie.
This is my life on Caerddol. We had, when we took on Caerddol, because of the way that the meadow, for the couple of years between the grazing coming off and us taking it on, because of the way that it had been managed, the grass had been cut but left on the meadow, and particularly along the edge of our boardwalk, which meant that we had this strip on either side of the boardwalk where we had really tall hogweed, loads of dock and loads of nettles. All of which are indicators of really high nitrogen environments. And it was because the grass clippings, the grass was being cut and left on multiple times a year, every single, well, it went on for about 3 years, and it just built up this strip. And as Phoebe said with the nettles, there is definitely a place in this world for nettles, and we leave a huge nettle patch and a huge hogweed patch in Caerddol because the number of species of invertebrates that they attract is massive. There is also a little beetle that feeds on the dock leaves and quite a few moth species that feed on dock. So there's a place again for dock. The areas where we get dock actually really lend themselves to scrub growth. And so we have left a strip up the middle of our meadow where it's, you know, the dock has been allowed to grow, the brambles have been allowed to grow. It's become quite really strong, healthy, regenerating scrub and will eventually become woodland. And in that space is also the place where we dump all the risings from the meadow. So we're not in a position where we can pay to have the stuff that's cut from the meadow taken off the meadow. So we dump it all into this place where we can cope with a little bit more nutrient. And that's where the dock's allowed to be. That's where the nettles and the hogweed are allowed to be. And then in the main meadow, we will go around and literally over the past 8 years through just removing the seed heads and allowing the little dock beetles to eat the leaves of the dock to keep it down quite naturally, we've reduced the amount of dock in the meadow. All the dock that was growing in the bit that the council were cutting along the edges of the boardwalk has virtually disappeared. And what's replaced it is marsh woundwort, which is amazing. Which also likes a little bit of nutrient, but not quite as much nutrient as the dock, you know. So there is room for it, but just by doing very, very simple things, you can reduce it to a point where nature can do the rest of the work for you, I think is the point.
Robbie, do you have a view? A question's just popped up on the question and answers there about how to deal with creeping thistle.
Again, creeping thistle is something that's really, really good for nature and really good for wildlife, but it is something that likes that little bit more nutrient. Cutting, regular cutting really does keep down creeping thistle. Creeping thistle tends to really get a foothold where it's not got quite so much competition. So in very, very heavily grazed environments, you tend to get quite a lot of creeping thistle because there's nothing else for it to cope with, and the grazing animals won't take it out, particularly if they happen to be sheep. rather than cattle or horses or anything else. But again, cutting flower heads, so making sure you take the flower heads out before they seed, will really help to reduce creeping thistle, but also just making sure that maybe cut it twice each year if you can, or just the areas where you've got problems with creeping thistle, cut, you can cut multiple times in a year until you get on top of the problem.
So another question, Robbie, which again has literally just popped up, and I'll go back to the questions that came before, which is horsetail on a wet site. Have you got any experience of getting rid of that?
I am the wrong person to speak to about horsetail because it's one of my favourite plants. and actually it's one of the indicator species. So on a floodplain meadow, I would expect to see some of the wetland species of horsetails. They're a really important aspect of a floodplain meadow. Caerddol is a floodplain meadow, and so we do have 2 different species of horsetail on the site. And because of the fact that there's such an abundance of other things like meadowsweet and ragged robin and all the other things that grow there, the horsetail isn't a problem. It's not a problem like it would be in a garden. So weeds are only weeds when they're growing in the wrong place, I think is the most important thing to say about that. A horsetail growing in a wet meadow, absolutely perfect.
It's characteristic of that meadow, I think, and most of the people that have been asking questions about horsetail have obviously been in wet meadows, and it's going to be a component of that meadow. Just to flag up on the chat, I don't know if people notice, but there's an organisation called the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, which specialises in helping advise people about restoration and management of floodplain meadows. So anybody who's got a meadow that kind of is wet at any time during the year and potentially floods, they have some really, really good advice on their website. So if you just pop into Google the Floodplain Meadows Partnership, you'll find some really useful contacts across the country. They have a number of ambassadors around the country that can help support and advise, and they also have some very good guidance around management.
Floodplain Meadows Partnership came and helped us with our species surveys on Caerddol. They also helped us work out what soil conditions we had. Yeah. They helped us work out our hydrology and subsequently what we should be doing and could be doing for managing the site. And
just to also sort of add that floodplains, I mean, meadows that end up being inundated with water tend to be higher in nutrients because water is the water is carrying nutrients onto that floodplain. So management is even more important in that context. Yeah. And cutting and removing those cuttings is really, really critical to maintaining species diversity in floodplain meadows. But as I say, they've got some very good guidance, and they've got some really a lot of people with a lot of experience around managing those particular meadows. So if you're in that situation, it's definitely worth contacting them.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. There's one little area which, again, Phoebe mentioned we haven't discussed, which is insects. The need to provide for all insects. But somebody's asked a very specific question here, which is it true that having roadside habitat for insects means lots will be killed by passing cars? So it's not good to have a wildflower meadow site as a roadside verge?
No, it is. It definitely is. And if there's some takeoff by way of roadkill, shall we say, that's okay. It's better that it's there, that it's not there. We are in the middle of an insect apocalypse, and we need to provide spaces for our invertebrates wherever we can. And road verges, we have 500,000 miles worth of road verge network in the UK. It could absolutely transform the fortunes of our biodiversity, starting with our plants and our insects, if we manage them sympathetically. The fact that some will be taken out by traffic, as is the case with mammals and amphibians and other animals, is just a sort of something that we have to sort of, I suppose, accept. Can I just take the opportunity to say something very quickly about seeds, because there are some really great comments, for example, from Ruth Hayward, just about the need to look around your site as well as on your site in terms of what there is. Remember that a lot of plants are pollinated, disperse their seed on the wind and with the movement of human beings and vehicles. And if you look around your site, you might be pleasantly surprised that you have got adjacent wildflower rich areas that, if you prepared the ground right, could settle and germinate on your site. If that's not the case, if you're not in an area with any wildflower rich areas, then make sure that your seed is of known native provenance. There are lots of commercial companies out there, I'm not going to name them, but there are lots of commercial companies out there. There are lists on the Q website in particular of seed providers that ensure provenance, and that's the most important thing.
Can I just come in, Phoebe, as well? I mean, Plantlife also has a list of specialist suppliers across the country. So if anyone is interested, they're very welcome to contact us. Our contact details you can find on the Plantlife website. So you're very welcome to drop us a line and ask that question, and we'll be happy to let you know the details.
Yeah, and then another comment about seed for shaded areas coming in. There's obviously lots of beautiful, particularly spring flowers, of course, that you could go onto the Plantlife website. There are John Chambers woodland mixes for garden private areas that you can buy with things such as Enchanter's Nightshade, woodruff, stitchwort, celandine, gorgeous spring flowers that you can grow. Not really meadow species, more woodland and hedgerow species, but good shout there on the chat.
A last question, which I've got actually from the previous, from people who sent in, which is perhaps not directly related to today's event, but the point was made was that are sheep likely to eat out small special plants, and that they're not really good to use in a meadow, and that cattle would be better?
Complicated answer to that. Matt, do you want to go, or Robbie?
Yeah.
It's not that straightforward, is it?
No. Sheep are quite interesting things, and they're a lot more wily than you'd give them credit for. I live in an environment that is dominated by sheep. We have, here in Snowdonia, we have sheep farms everywhere. And one of the things that people don't really realize about sheep is that sheep learn behavior, and sheep have quite an interesting grazing pattern during the course of the day. In the mornings, they tend to eat all the good stuff. So if you see sheep grazing in the morning, they'll be looking for really nice herbs and all the really special things that we really want to be growing in our meadows. And then in the afternoon, they'll fill their stomachs after a bit of a sleep before they go to bed at night. They do tend to graze from side to side and close crop. So depending on what you're trying to achieve in a meadow, sheep can be really positive or potentially negative. If you're wanting to really get that sword down over the winter, or or just before things get going in the spring, then sheep are absolutely brilliant. But if you want to have kind of a more rough style of grazing, then go with cattle. Goats will take out scrub and harder vegetation. But also don't forget that geese are also really good grazers. Rabbits are good grazers. I know people that have set up really great home garden meadows, and they just move their rabbit run onto the meadow for a bit and move it around the meadow to really get the sword down over the winter. So, different types of grazing for different jobs, I think, is the way forward. Not one thing's good or one thing's bad.
That's great. Thanks, Robbie. A question that's also come up on the Q&A is about the use of finger bar mowers or rotating mowers. Hang on, let me just pick up the Q&A. It's the again, thinking about invertebrates and perhaps, the mortality of invertebrates. Could you comment on the benefits of finger bar mowers over rotating blade mowers on the mortality of invertebrates?
I'm not sure if we're necessarily best placed to answer that question. I suspect there are other people, you know, more within that sector that would be able to answer them. I mean, it would be logical that a finger bar mow is probably going to be less harmful. But those aren't particularly widespread anymore. They're fairly old-fashioned mowers, and most people don't use them. So,
what I would say is that regardless of the type of mower, the way in which you mow the site can really help with invertebrate care and conservation. So, for example, mowing from the middle outwards gives them time to move out rather than trapping them in the centre. Similarly, you know, there's absolutely no reason why you have to cut all of the site at once or all of the site at all. When we consult large landowners in Wales on managing grassland for invertebrates, we are always talking about leaving longer areas as refugia for invertebrates. Again, that mosaic management psychology is, I guess, where I'm trying to plug Meadows as part of a bigger mix of vegetation patterns and types. And when you're mowing, you can bear that in mind and leave longer bits and bobs. Wavy edges as well. Wavy edges are really great for butterfly larvae and eggs and stuff. Overhanging vegetation, so you can a path going through a meadow. The edges are often the richest in invertebrate interest.
Can I just come in there as well and add something? I mean, especially if you're managing a small area, you're not necessarily being, you know, you're not commercially farming an area, which I imagine some people on the call aren't. So, you know, it isn't necessarily the necessity to cut every single blade of grass in that meadow. The other thing is that you potentially can vary the time that you cut your meadow. You don't always have to cut it at the same time. You can vary it one year, you can cut it a bit earlier, and you can cut it a bit later another year. So as long as you allow some of those flowers to flower and set seed, you know, but you can certainly cut it later, so that gives you more structure and you know, more habitat for those invertebrates longer to complete their life cycle. So, and as Phoebe said, leaving areas of the meadow as well is obviously a good thing. So, and I think it was picked up on the chat, and a couple of comments said that we hadn't mentioned invertebrates, and obviously we're not suggesting that you don't think about invertebrates when you manage these kind of meadows.
But it's a great point. I mean, actually, a lot of traditional meadow management was actually quite destructive at points for invertebrates, especially when they were cut quite early on, which they were for reasons, weather or economic requirements of livestock management. So there's no judgment there, but it's absolutely right to be thinking about that mosaic. If you happen to be lucky enough to have a site where you don't need to produce food or feed livestock from it, you can manage it for biodiversity. That mosaic approach is absolutely key for invertebrates.
Great, everybody, this has been the most incredibly interesting webinar, and we've got a couple of minutes to go, so I'm just going to have two quick last questions and then we'll have to say no to the rest of the questions. One is, in response to that discussion we've just had, is how short should it be cut? And the second is, do chickens in runs get rid of bracken? Two quick answers and then we'll that's it.
I don't know about chickens and bracken.
No experience with chickens and bracken, I'm afraid.
I'd love it if you tried that, because they do root around on a little mini scale with their feet. So pigs
have been used in different parts of the country to remove bracken. So
I think chickens get rid of everything.
Chickens. Yeah.
And they may well eat some of the seeds in the seed bank, which is some of the things you might want to try and keep. So
I'd totally love to know about the chickens. Please give it a go and let us know.
Bashing your bracken through a few times a year is often a really good way of reducing its strength and if you've got a problem with bracken, just kind of take a stick to it, bash it if it's not too much of a problem, or you can get machines that'll bash bracken. But bracken's actually really good for establishing things like bluebells and other wildflowers. So, you know, just consider what the consequences of getting rid of it might be.
Speak a bit.
Great. Thank you all so much, and everybody behind the scenes who contributed to a really fascinating evening. I hope everybody listening in has enjoyed it all, and it will be recorded and put up. I think it's on the PFLA YouTube channel in a couple of days' time. So please do watch out it and tell your friends to watch it for all the advice that's been dished out tonight. So thanks everybody, and look forward to the next one, which is actually, it's going to be on the economics of diverse pastures from the point of view of farming. And I haven't got my diary. I think it's the 21st of October. Hold on. We'll be putting it out. It is, yeah, it's 5:30 on the 21st of October. So please do sign in again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.